Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone. Well, this week I finally got round to watching the movie Split, and I really enjoyed it. Before I go any further, please let me point out that if you don't want any spoilers about Split, you haven't seen it yet, you haven't watched it on Blu-ray or DVD, and you're planning to do that, you are going to want to stop this video right now, go and watch the film, and then come back. There are going to be lots and lots of spoilers. This whole thing is just riddled with spoilers. So if you don't even want to know anything at all about it, switch it off now and come back later. In the meantime, for those of you that do, in this episode, what I want to do is I want to really unpack a lot of what I think people might have missed about Split and why this is such a good and important movie. And also to finish with, I want to make some prediction about where I think the next film in this what is going to be a trilogy, what's going to happen next from here with this story. So first, an obvious point to make is that for those who might have missed it, and I don't know if too many have, but this is a direct sequel to Unbreakable. I know some people were talking about this movie and saying this movie exists in the same universe as Unbreakable. It's actually more than that. This is M. Night Shyamalan creating a sequel. It is the second film in a trilogy in the Unbreakable story. It's the same story, it's the same characters, it's the same story arc developing throughout this film. It's an origins film again, just like Unbreakable was, except this time it's two origin stories in one. Now that's another thing I think some people have missed. A lot of people thinking, oh, this is an origin story for the villain. It's actually more than that. There's two origin stories in this film. So with that in mind, let's look at some of the important stuff that I think some people may have missed. We know from Unbreakable, first of all, that villains and superheroes are kind of mirror images of each other. They are sort of two sides, or different sides of the same coin. And they are almost, the villains in particular, are kind of like a mirror copy of their superhero opponent and vice versa. And when you look at Split and Unbreakable, you see that clearly playing out. A lot of work, I think, has gone into thinking through Kevin, the Horde, who I'm going to call alternately probably Kevin or the Horde throughout this video. But they both have a lot of similarities. First of all, both of them experienced their rebirth into their superhero characters, or their super identities, the supervillain and the superhero, on a train. Both of them were rebirthed on a train. Both of them have a weakness, we know now. We know that obviously from Unbreakable that David Dunn, Bruce Willis's character, his weakness is water. And we also know now that the Horde, the weakness of the Horde is saying Kevin's full name. If you say the full name, then the Horde are pulled out of the light. Both characters have older women who know what their weakness is. Dr. Fletcher, who is the therapist in Split, knows what the Horde's weakness is. You know, she knows that if you say the full name, that brings Kevin into the light. And also, in the original film, Unbreakable, there was an older school teacher who tells David Dunn about his weakness, which is water, when he fell into the swimming pool and he was on the bottom of the pool for, what, 5 minutes, I think it was, they say. Both characters are invincible. Both have super strength. Both have jobs that are consistent with their super identities, which is exactly what Elijah Price, Mr. Glass, said about David Dunn in the first movie, that people choose jobs that are consistent with their identities. So David Dunn is a protector, he's a sentry, and so he has a job as a security guard. And Kevin, who is the Horde, this group of beasts, he has a job working with beasts at the zoo. In fact, there's one point towards the end of Split when Casey is being chased, and you see the lockers, and you can see a green cap and a green poncho, rain poncho, very similar to the one, if not identical to the one that David Dunn wears throughout much of Unbreakable, is hanging up in that locker room. And once again, it's a clear visual clue that these men are very much two sides or different sides of the same coin. Both of them have a mentor who ushers them in to their new identity. Obviously, David Dunn has Mr. Glass, and the Horde has Dr. Fletcher. Both were victims of bullying by young people. Kevin experienced bullying at the hands of those two girls, and David Dunn experienced bullying as a young boy by two other young kids when he was young himself. Both of them at the start of the film are really struggling to find their true identity, and they're confused about it. They don't know their place in the world, they don't know their purpose, but they're trying to find it. And there's a real struggle going on there. And this is an interesting point that you may not have seen, is that both of them at the start of the film are facing the possibility of new lives being lived outside of Philadelphia. Now, we know they're in Philadelphia. There's not really many clues in the film until we get to that scene where Dr. Fletcher turns up at the zoo and she gets out of a Philadelphia taxi. So they're both in Philadelphia. Their origin stories take place there. But you'll remember at the start of Unbreakable, David Dunn has been on the train and he's applied for a job in New York. So he was thinking about starting a new life in New York, which is an hour north of Philadelphia. Meanwhile, in this film, Kevin, remember at the very beginning, he's talking to Dr. Fletcher and she says that she's made arrangements for him so that a co-worker of hers in Baltimore will take over his case when she gets too old, or I guess passes on, and so he'll always have someone to care for him. Now, Baltimore, interestingly, is an hour south of Philadelphia. And what's kind of interesting about that is that the assumption here is that he'll probably have to move to Baltimore because he has so many visits with his therapist. But even if he didn't, and he was going to keep traveling for those visits, the way in which Dr. Fletcher is presented, you'll remember at one point in the film, she talks about the fact that that Kevin is more than just a patient. He's like family to her. So even if he's still traveling, basically it's like him starting a new family life with this new therapist. It's a whole new life for him in Baltimore. And both men fall victim to their vulnerability, to their weakness, before rising again in that sort of final battle moment that they have in their movies. Obviously, David is pushed into the pool before rising again, and Kevin has his name spoken by Casey before the beast returns again. Now, this is another key point that some people have picked up on and others seem to have missed, is that Kevin's father almost certainly was killed by the very same train accident that Bruce Willis was on at the start of Unbreakable, the one that Mr. Glass had orchestrated to try in his effort to try and find other superheroes. And I say this because there's a brief mention when he's talking to the therapist about that train yard, why the train yard is so important. And we are told that his father left on a train. In other words, his father is gone and never came back. Every indication is that his father is dead. And you see this most clearly spelt out when he goes, when Kevin goes to the train to be reborn as the Beast. You notice that he takes he goes and purchases a bouquet of what are clearly meant to be memorial flowers. They're not for the Beast. They are left on the side of the track, the side of the train tracks, very carefully. They don't go onto the train with him. And once he becomes the Beast takes off and doesn't actually take the flowers. So clearly this is a type of memorial for his father, who we know left on a train. And also both of the men, as I said, experience their rebirths on trains. So it's almost certain that it is the same train event which has actually caused both of these men to arise in the story, if you like. When Kevin is describing the Beast in Split, he describes the exact character we see on the cover of the very first comic book that is shown in Unbreakable. You might remember that scene at the beginning of Unbreakable where Mr. Glass, Elijah Price, is basically he's a young boy and he's sort of, I don't know, he's too scared, he's become introverted, he doesn't want to go outside because he keeps breaking his bones. And his mother convinces him that he has to go outside. And so what she does to coax him outside is, you remember, she gets that purple box, and inside the box is his very first comic book. And on the cover of that very first comic book is a superhero who quite clearly, as the film unfolds, we discover is really, I think, meant to be a personification of David Dunn, Bruce Willis's character. And he's facing off against a villain, and the villain is a beast. And the villain matches the description that is given by Kevin in Split when he's talking about what the beast is like. He's tall, he's strong, muscular, he has a mane of long hair, and he has long fingers. And the beast that you see on the front of that comic book is exactly the character that he's describing here. There's another also interesting crossover with the two comics. In Unbreakable, you might remember that scene where Mr. Glass goes to the comic book shop and he's despondent. He becomes despondent because he's starting to think that maybe David Dunn is not a superhero after all. And he sits in the comic book shop, and the young guy who runs the place wants to go and have his dinner, and he finally wheels him out because he just won't even talk to him. He's just sort of looking off, staring off into the distance. And as he's wheeling him out of the shop, he sort of grabs his own wheels on the wheelchair a couple of times, Mr. Glass does, and deliberately knocks into the stands that are filled with comic books. And on the third time that he does this, a pile of comic books fall off a top shelf, and one of the comic books ends up falling into his lap, and he holds it up and he says, "I'll take this." And it's interesting, if you look at the cover of that book, the title of the comic book is called Century Man versus Coalition of Evil. Now, Century Man, I think, is clearly meant to be David Dunn. We are told that he is a protector in Unbreakable. He is a security guard. He is a sentry. That's what sentries are. They are guards. They are protectors. So Century Man versus Coalition of Evil. And you see the Coalition of Evil featured on the front cover, facing off and surrounding Century Man. And who are the Coalition of Evil? They are a horde of different beasts. There's a group of beasts there. And that is almost certainly something that M. Night Shyamalan has gone back to for Split. And remember at the end of the film when the newscaster tells us it's not just that one of his personalities is a beast. We are told, remember, that one of his personalities is multiple beasts. It's modelled on multiple beasts from the zoo where he worked. In other words, this is the Horde. The Horde is, I think, the Coalition of Evil, and obviously David Dunn is Century Man. On the question of how Mr. Glass fits into all of the events in Split, I think there's lots of clues, and one big one in particular, that Elijah Price, Mr. Glass, has already made contact with Kevin. He's already been in contact with the Horde, and he's actually the evil genius who is helping to facilitate these events unfold, certainly the arrival of the Horde anyway. There's one really big clue in particular that we see. You'll remember when Kevin's therapist, Dr. Fletcher, turns up to the zoo, and she turns up and she's talking to him outside the gates before they go in that evening, and she discovers that he's got those women held captive, and she tells Kevin that he's extraordinary. And he's really positive about the fact that she's told him this, and then he turns around to her and he says, "This is exactly what the beast says." He says, you're saying things just like the beast says them. But here's the interesting question. Where is the beast getting these ideas from? Because the beast, remember, has not met Dr. Fletcher. She has never met the beast. So where are these ideas coming from? And what's interesting is if you go back to Unbreakable, this is explicitly a sentiment that is expressed by Mr. Glass. There's a scene, I think it's when he's talking with David Dunn's wife and he's trying to convince her. And he makes this comment where he says that these people, and I'm quoting here, have extraordinary things inside themselves. It's almost as if that line was the sort of the foundational seminal moment, the genesis, if you like, for the beginnings of the concept of Split and what's going to happen in that film. We know already from M. Night Shyamalan that Split was actually intended to be part of the original film, but he just felt it wasn't sort of consistent enough to try and jam it into the first movie, and so he's created this film and really expanded the story. But it's pretty clear, I think, that it's Mr. Glass where these ideas have come from. And so the Beast has probably been in contact with Mr. Glass. Now, there's a couple of clues, I think, that this has happened. One of Kevin's identities, one of his 23 known identities, before he takes on the 24th of the Beast, is that we see on the computer screen each identity has left a little video diary, and one of the identities is called Samuel. I think that's probably almost certainly an Easter egg. It's a hint back and a pointer back to Samuel L. Jackson, who plays Mr. Glass. But not only that, but the key identity, the one identity that is key to this whole event unfolding, is Hedwig. Hedwig has the power to access the light at will, and that's why he's so important. Without him, these events, these undesirable personalities, as she calls them at one point, they can't achieve their plan. So Hedwig is absolutely essential. Now, here's the really interesting thing. Hedwig, which kind of might seem like an odd name, Hedwig is actually a type of glass. It's called Hedwig glass. I don't think it's any coincidence that the key character is named after a type of glass. And Mr. Glass is this evil genius from Unbreakable who is sort of orchestrating all these events. Now, is it possible that they've met? Because, it's going to take a little bit of creative storytelling to make that all make sense in the next and final film. But I think it's more than possible. As I said, Mr. Glass is an evil villain. He's a genius, right? He's this evil genius who's been orchestrating these complex plots for a while. We saw in Unbreakable that he is regularly, or had been regularly, making contact with people to achieve his plans. Remember, he's talking at the bar with that guy who's the building manager about that building that he burns down. He goes and seeks out David Dunn's wife, and he sets it up so that he's able to go to her for his physiotherapy. He pursues and finds David Dunn. He's very resourceful in that regard, and we all know the old trope of the evil genius. Even though they might be locked away in an asylum, they are capable of manipulating others and still being able to communicate. He might not be able to get out, but it's certainly believable that he's able to communicate. And there's also, you might remember that Dr. Fletcher, towards the beginning of the film, tells Kevin, she asks, are people interested? Well, he asks, are people interested? And she says that more people are listening, to the story. She's got this theory, this idea that this is this new form of human development, that these people are not mentally unwell, but instead that this is some new superpower, effectively, that is expressing itself in the human experience. And it's clear she's giving conferences, she's writing papers, she's giving lectures on this topic all around the place. So it is highly likely that at some point Mr. Glass has heard about this or has made contact and has been able to connect with Kevin to begin to help try and facilitate these events. We've seen in the first film that he does this kind of thing. The other thing I think is kind of a little pointer to this is at the end of Split, the Horde is free. The Horde has not been captured. Now, it would seem to me that if Mr. Glass and the Horde had not already met, then the most obvious way to facilitate that happening would be for the Horde to have been arrested at the end of this movie Split, and for them, both of those characters, to end up together in the same asylum for the criminally insane where Mr. Glass is. But that doesn't happen, and that suggests to me that perhaps they've already met, and so there's no need for that to happen. So the big $1 million question is, what happens next? Well, and this is something that I think some people may have missed here, Split is not actually just one origins tale, it's two origin stories, and this is really important. We know from Unbreakable that there are two types of supervillains. Mr. Glass tells us this himself. There is what he calls the soldier villain, who is the strong, powerful villain who fights the physical fights. And then there is what he calls the arch villain. And Mr. Glass is the arch villain. The arch villain is the genius who uses their mind to concoct these amazing evil schemes and to see them executed. So there's two types of villains. And when you think about it, in the first film we sort of thought that Mr. Glass was like David Dunn's nemesis, but really he's not. David Dunn, his superhero is really very much about his physical strength and physical dominance that he has. But Mr. Glass is not a soldier villain. He's the exact opposite. He's extremely vulnerable. He just needs to be pushed a couple of times, and it's conceivable that that would be the end of him as an evil villain. And interestingly enough, they are not really mirror opposites either. If you look at it, they actually both, and Mr. Glass tells us this, they both have the exact same weakness, which is water. Neither of them can handle water. It's the same weakness, which kind of doesn't really make sense when you think about it, that they would have the exact same weakness. So it seems to me that clearly they're different types of characters, even though the ultimate arch nemesis here really is Mr. Glass. He is the evil genius who is sort of exacting this plan. We also know that M. Night Shyamalan deliberately uses alliteration. He used it deliberately in Unbreakable. He's talked about it in interviews. And he loved that whole concept that you see a lot of with superheroes, where you have like Peter Parker or Clark Kent. You have a character whose first and last name has, both of them have similar sounds, or they have the same first letter in their first and their last name, like Peter Parker, for example. And he did this deliberately with Bruce Willis's character, who is called David Dunn. It's done that way on purpose. Now, this brings us back to Split, because like I said, Split isn't just an origins tale about the Horde. It's also the origins tale of Casey. And the character Casey, the girl who survives and gets out of that zoo basement at the very end, a lot of people haven't realised that her full name is Casey Cook. Her name is deliberately alliterated. David Dunn and Casey Cook. DD and CC, okay? She's clearly some sort of key character in this whole story arc. But the interesting thing is, she's not a soldier hero or a soldier villain. So she's either going to be an arch villain, like a genius of some kind, or an arch superhero who is going to have a key leadership role, who is actually going to direct things either for good or for evil. Now, we know that she's smart. She outsmarts the Horde. This whole film, she is constantly pitting her wits against the Horde. And in fact, the terrible suffering she's experienced has clearly been about using your wits to try and outsmart other people. So she's clearly someone, and she shows that she outsmarts the Horde in this film. The other interesting point is she's an art student. And what was Mr. Glass? He was an art dealer. I don't think that's an accident. I think that's on purpose. Clearly, they both have the same sort of career, if you like. And again, remember that point about how they choose careers that are consistent with their super identities? An art dealer is someone who exists, who has a vision. They exist with the visual, which is related to having a vision. They exist with ideas and higher concepts. That's what you think of when you think about people who occupy the art world. Even if a lot of it's perhaps overblown and a bit hoity-toity, as they say, that's definitely, they exist in that sort of realm of the mind. And once again, vision is quite important. And she's clearly in that sort of category as well, despite the fact of her own sort of perhaps working class upbringing and the suffering she's experienced. And there's another interesting thing that happens. You see at the very end scene where the police officer leans into the car and tells her that her uncle is here. And the police officer says to her, "Your uncle's here, you ready to go?" It's kind of strange the way that line is delivered, and it's also really interesting to watch Casey Cook's response. She just stares at the camera. She's looking at the police officer, obviously. She's not crying. She hasn't got tears in her eyes. She's not scared. We've seen those emotions from her previously in this film. She's not displaying any of those. Instead, what there clearly appears to be on her face is a look of sort of anticipation or contemplation. She's contemplating something. And it's almost as if the police officer's asking her the question, you've got this new identity now. Are you ready to assume it? Are you ready to go? In other words, go and do what you have to do. It's not really, it's just the way it's delivered and the look on her face. It's just clearly something more is going on here. And that's the question. Which way is she going to go here? Is she going to become a supervillain? Is she going to go and kill her uncle, or is she going to become a superhero? And is she going to free herself from this oppression and somehow see her uncle punished in a way that is just? Which way is she going to go? And then the bigger question going forward, which way is she going to go in the next movie? I think in the next film we are going to see the Horde. My suspicion is the Horde is going to try and break Mr. Glass out of the asylum. He can't break out himself. He needs a soldier villain, and the Horde would be the perfect soldier villain for him. And I think the two of them are going to work together to try and kidnap perhaps or convince Casey Cook to team up with them to fight and defeat David Dunn. And I think this won't be as difficult for them as it sounds, because in a sense, you get the sense that she sort of owes a debt of gratitude, even in a very warped kind of way, to the Horde, because the Horde have allowed her to discover her true identity and to become empowered and to fight back. And so there's all that sort of going on. I suspect also that David Dunn's son, you might remember him from Unbreakable, may come back into the picture in some way in the story. You'll remember that in Unbreakable, green was the specific superhero colour for David Dunn's character. Green was his character. You see him wearing that green poncho. The superhero comic personifications of David Dunn's character, or who are clearly meant to point to him, are all wearing green at some point or another. Green is quite fundamental to his character. And at the very end of Unbreakable, David's son, when he passes the newspaper over to him to show what he's done in saving that family, David's son is wearing a bright green t-shirt. And I think that's an indication here. It could be one of two things. It could be a visual cue to say, hey, now that David has found his true identity, his son has sort of, the green signifies some sort of peace and contentment that has come to their home. And perhaps that's what they're trying to say, that his son has sort of found himself too, now that Dad has. Or it could be a sort of indication that in actual fact his son, it's a visual cue that his son also has some sort of superhero ability that we just don't know about. You remember also that Casey Cook can defeat the Horde. She knows what the weaknesses of the Horde, and she's also invincible when it comes to fighting the Horde because she has been broken. She's already been broken. Remember, he leaves her alone. I think what's going to happen in the next film is that the Horde will ultimately come to see David Dunn as his ultimate nemesis, enemy who must absolutely be destroyed at all costs for two reasons. Number one, David Dunn is unbreakable. Remember that line in the film when he is talking to Casey and he said, "The broken are the more evolved." So not only is David Dunn a lower form of life in his eyes, but he's even worse than that because other human beings are guilty, if you like, and impure because they haven't experienced brokenness. But David Dunn can't experience brokenness because he's a superhero and he is unbreakable. He can't experience like the rest of us. So he is more than just your ordinary human that the Horde feels they must punish. It'd be almost like he must be like the devil to the Horde because he is this evil character who can never be broken, let alone has never experienced brokenness. The other thing, of course, is that I think that he will come to hate David Dunn and he will blame him for being the cause of that train wreck which killed his father. Now, obviously, Mr. Glass set that whole thing up. He's the ultimate one who's responsible for that. But I think the Horde, Mr. Glass might lie to him. I don't know. Maybe he'll lie to him and maybe there'll be a redemption moment where he will realise and he will change sides. I don't know. Or possibly, I think he will just be so deranged that he will think that Mr. Glass was justified in doing what he had to do, and that in actual fact, David Dunn is really the one to blame because if he didn't exist in the world, then that train wreck would have never needed to happen, and so it's all David Dunn's fault. There's another interesting little point where you remember towards the end of the film, and Kevin, the character Kevin, or the personality of Kevin appears, and he specifically mentions a date. He says, "The last thing I remember was being on a bus on September the 18th, 2014. It's kind of weird. I thought to myself afterwards, why did he mention that specific date? It doesn't appear to correlate with anything in this film. And maybe, just maybe, they were trying to say that it show how long it had been many years since Kevin had actually been present. That's a possibility. Or maybe September the 18th, 2014 is an anniversary of something that has triggered all of this because that's the last time he remembers being present. It does seem to me that it was such a specific date to mention that perhaps it has, and we're going to find out, it has something very specific. It's an anniversary. Now, I have a suspicion it might be the anniversary of that original train derailment that started this whole franchise in motion. Now, we don't know. I couldn't see anything in Unbreakable that indicates the date at which that train derailment takes place. However, at the very end of the film, when David Dunn is sitting with his son and he slides the newspaper across, you can actually see the date at the top of the newspaper, and it's October the 23rd by the looks of it. Now, that's interesting because if these events unfolded over a period of weeks, and starting from the train wreck and then over a period of weeks of meeting with Elijah and uncertainty and everything else before David Dunn finally embraces his true identity and then goes and saves that family from the Orange Man, it's quite conceivable that September the 18th was the actual date of that train derailment, and then just over a month later was when David Dunn embraced his true superhero identity. And so possibly that's why he doesn't remember anything after September the 18th, because for some reason there's been a fracture in his mind because of the trauma and the tragedy of that event, and that has triggered this whole thing into motion. And maybe, just maybe, it's possible that Mr. Glass has made contact with him and reminded him somehow, or maybe he'd just been to visit Mr. Glass, or he'd been in contact with Mr. Glass and he was on a bus home or something, and it was the date of that train crash that has killed his father, and so maybe that's what triggered this whole thing and has started this whole story we see in Split in motion. Now, if Mr. Glass is the one who has planted the ideas in the mind of the Beast, in the mind of Kevin, about this new stage of human evolution and the fact that he's extraordinary, etc., then it's possible that he will try and bring about an apocalyptic event in the next film to usher in this new age of superheroes, this new enlightened age, or bring back this age of superheroes, depending on how you view it. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a cataclysmic event that will destroy the world. It could be a very localized thing. It might be a matter of him doing something cataclysmic to bring forth some people that he knows or he believes. Perhaps he is going to create more supervillains like the Horde, and he is going to try and do things to cause them to arise. Or perhaps he has found out about a group of young children who are actually going to be just like David Dunn, who are going to grow up to be superheroes, and so he's going to try and destroy them. So based on what we've seen in the first two films, I would not be surprised if it's a very localized sort of thing, but still has that apocalyptic flair to it. So there you go. That's my 2 cents worth. That's the things that you may have missed and why I think this is actually a pretty good film. Just to finish with, there are 2 things, even though I really like Split, and I've watched it a couple of times, and you definitely get a lot more out of it after going back again and watching it through again. You really see that this is quite a clever piece of filmmaking. But there's 2 things that I didn't like. Number one, and I recognise that I don't know how he could have fixed this. I don't think there's really any other way he could have got around this. But because of the fact that he was really trying to pull the ultimate M. Night Shyamalan, and he was hiding from us the fact that we were watching a completely different film to what we were actually watching. We thought we were watching a story about a serial killer who had multiple personalities, right? That's what we thought we were watching all the way up until the end. And then we discover, not only we discover that he can actually make these things sort of come real, but then we discover at the end that this is actually a sequel, and this is a continuation of David Dunn's character story and that whole universe that we saw first introduced in Unbreakable. It's a completely different film. In order to hide that fact from us and not give the game away, he couldn't basically have it filmed in the same style. He couldn't have the same sort of tone and cinematic look in the way he was making and crafting shots. And he definitely couldn't use the same musical score. But as a result, I mean, look, I love the score in this film. There's some really beautiful bits of music in this, but it felt that there was a bit of the magic of Unbreakable, and what made Unbreakable so unique and so great, particularly the musical score, it was missing in this film. And I think it would have been great to have seen that, but unfortunately I don't know how you could have done that without everyone would have figured out, hold on, why am I hearing these same musical cues? Why am I seeing the same style of film here? Why does it look visually the same? Is this the same universe? Is this a sequel? You would have figured out probably pretty quickly. So he's very clever the way he's hidden that, but as a result, I think there's a bit of that magic missing. Number 2, in this film, there's quite a lot of emphasis on Kevin. And part of that is because obviously his origins tale is important, but also because of the fact that James McAvoy just was so phenomenal as an actor. He really did sort of steal the limelight, and he played this character or these group of characters just so well. It was really excellent acting. And what it's easy to forget is that that Casey Cook, the actress playing Casey Cook, her acting was pretty darn good as well. It was really good, but because McAvoy was so good, it really drew a lot of emphasis, and also the way it's written, it really drew a lot of emphasis onto the Horde, on the character of Kevin. And that's a bit unfortunate, I think, because Unbreakable, the focus, despite Mr. Glass being there, the focus was really on the humanity of the story. It was strongly focused on David Dunn and his struggles and his loss of identity and purpose and meaning in life. And also when we do see Mr. Glass, there's very much a focus on the human elements. We see a lot of his backstory. We have a lot of sympathy for him because of his vulnerability and his weakness. It's a very sort of human character that we encounter, despite the fact that he's very dark, and a lot of dark things happen in Unbreakable. But in Split, it just felt like the darkness was more to the fore, and the sort of humanity and that really sort of engaging beauty, if you like, in Unbreakable is missing from Split a little bit. And I don't think this needed to happen. I think they could have told the story a little bit different. But as I said, it's not the end of the world. It is still, I think, a really good movie, and they still managed to bring those important moments to the fore. I just think this film could have had a bit more power and a bit more impact if we'd seen more of the humanity of Casey Cook. And I think it would have made particularly that crescendo at the end. It was powerful, but I think it would have really elevated that crescendo where the beast tells her that that she is already pure because she has experienced so much suffering in her life. And if that suffering had sort of been, I don't know, it just felt like the focus was on the darkness rather than the humans experiencing that darkness. Whereas Unbreakable, it definitely was a movie where the focus was on the human beings who experience the darkness rather than on the darkness itself. Having said that, it is a really clever and well-crafted sequel. It really is M. Night Shyamalan's Empire Strikes Back. He is now set up, he has left us on this cliffhanger. What is going to happen next? Where are these characters going to go? Where is the story going to develop? It's a really well-crafted sequel, and he's created an excellent universe here. He is, well, once again, just what we saw with Logan, is that someone else has out-marveled Marvel. And, I know they're different types of films, but man, I'm really looking forward to this third movie now, and I'm really interested to see where he takes this and whether we get a full-blown sort of epic superhero thing or whether he keeps that toned-down nature that focuses in on the humanity and the struggle that really lies at the heart of these stories. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.